Okay team, welcome back. In this section we are going to understand the entire risk management. Not only risk assessment, we are going to cover the entire risk management process in a very nutshell, right? You can say 25 to 30 minutes boost to you for the exam, CISSP exam. So what is actually risk management? Risk management is actually an activity for managing risk, right? So that you have a structured approach to quantify, to identify, to quantify, to prioritize, and to remediate the risk, and then to monitor the risk as well. Entire information security controls, whatever controls we implement in the information security has to be completely based on risk management process, because that's in the core of the entire information security. And for that function, you need to first understand few terms so that your base is ready for the same. Number one, we will understand what is an asset. So asset is something of value to you for the business, without which you might suffer and you might lose competitive advantage and all of it. So anything of value to the company is called as an asset. At the same time, every asset must also have asset valuation as well. Okay. Why it is so important? Because end of the day, you are going to implement security based on some kind of prioritization, and for that entire prioritization, having the asset value will be very, very critical. And for example, let's say a breach happens in a particular company, and that company want to do the impact assessment. Okay, what have we lost? What is the entire damage which has happened? What is the impact which has happened? For doing that as well, you need the asset valuation. So that's kind of very, very important. In companies, we do maintain asset valuation sometimes in the qualitative form, which means you are going to say, okay, this is highly critical to me, this is business critical to me, this is project critical to me, and those kind of things, right? And it can also be maintained in a quantitative method. So those companies who are already in a good maturity curve already, especially you will find in the BFSI sector, banking and finance sector and all, you might find that they often go with more quantitative approach, because end of the day they want more specific result when they do their risk assessment, right? So that's what about asset valuation. Now these assets need to be protected because obviously there is a threat to them. So what is actually a threat? So a threat is something which can cause harm to you. That's an threat. For example, flood, for example, your downtime, for example, hacking, for example, data breach. All of these are kind of threats to any company, right? And these kind of threat actually comes to you by using some kind of agent, threat agent. So a threat agent is something which actually brings threat to you, which actually invite threat and cause some kind of risk. For example, fire is a threat, but fire can happen in multiple ways. It can also happen by a short circuit as well. So that's a threat agent, right? So that's your threat. A threat cannot be realized if you do not have a vulnerability. Now, what is a vulnerability? Vulnerability is something, a weakness, right? It is a weakness, you can say, or it is a lack of a control. A weakness exists because a control is not there, right? Lack of a control. So that's a vulnerability. Normally what happens is a threat agent will exploit a vulnerability and then cause you risk. So the fifth element we are going to talk about is risk. What is risk? So a risk can be positive as well, a risk can be negative as well. Okay. Now you might wonder, how come a risk can be positive? Guys, we always say, right, no gains without pains. The more risk you take, the more you earn. So for example, there is a startup will like to take more risk because they want to go aggressive at it. They are more risk aggressive, At the same time, a mature organization want to take minimum amount of risk. So for them, it is a risk. So if the risk is below a certain level, it becomes an opportunity. But if it goes above that particular level, then it can be a negative impact on the business. In the ISO terms, they also call it as uncertainty. In ISO, the risk in ISO 27005, they call risk as a uncertainty. So uncertainty to meet your objectives because of XYZ reason, that's a risk for you. Okay. Normally, a risk is of two types. Even though there are risk of multiple types, obviously on a company level, there are a lot many different type of risk: liquidity risk, market risk, project risk, people risk, and a lot of it, right? But we are not going to talk about that. In information security, we are more focused on the IT risk. And this risk can be, whenever we calculate this particular risk, it can be calculated, and then when we calculate them, it can be inherent risk. A inherent risk is the risk which exists before you implement the controls, before you treat the controls. And because there is some inherent risk which is above your acceptable level, you actually go and implement some controls. And when you implement some controls, there is still some kind of a risk which is left out. Risk cannot be mitigated 100%. So there is always some kind of residual risk as well. So this residual risk is the risk remaining after you implement certain controls. Simple terms. Now, risk can be calculated based on two things. Number one is called as likelihood, and the another one is called as impact. Whenever we do risk analysis, we actually calculate it based on these two factors, likelihood into impact. And likelihood is how likely it is that a particular risk will happen. It might be that it is very certain to happen, and it might be that this is possible to happen, or it might also be that this is very rare to happen. Now, the chances of a aircraft falling on me right now sitting in this meeting can be very, very less, very, very rare, isn't it? So that's what. Impact is the damage which happens once a risk is realized. Okay, once a risk is realized, what kind of impact can happen? Now, this impact can be in multiple ways. It can be loss of manpower, it can be disruptions, it can be the risk from compliance, not meeting the compliance thing, it can be fines, it can be data breach, you lost customer data, there can be some legal litigations on you, and so much of different type of risk which can happen, right? So that's the impact. Okay, now what is risk identification? Risk identification is a structured approach to identify risk in your environment, and for that companies actually follow a process which is called as risk assessment. Company follow risk assessment to identify and then quantify later on the risk in your particular environment. So how does this happen? You might be a guy who have recently joined a risk assessment team, and you are just trying to learn everything. What can happen is the core team, the core risk assessment team might reach to different business owners and the project managers and all line of business, right? And all of these people to identify the risk in their areas. Okay. To do this, they have to do this all activity might be by doing some surveys. They might do this entire thing by sending some questionnaires. They might like to interview people, right? And so many things. Okay, risk assessment. Whenever we are doing the risk assessment, okay, the risk identification, it is very important that first you understand the purpose, what for we are doing the risk assessment. Sometimes it is done for meeting the compliance, sometimes it's done for identifying the gaps in the environment, and so on. So you need to be very clear about the purpose of the risk assessment, because based on that only you are going to interact with different people. Okay, that's the first thing. Once you identify the purpose, the next important thing is to decide on the scope of risk assessment. Obviously, in one single go, you cannot do the entire company risk assessment. It's not practically feasible, guys. I tell you, it's a very resource intensive and very much cohesive activity which you have to do. So you have to be very clear on what is that I am going to do the risk assessment on. Those kind of assets, those kind of processes, those kind of people you are going to interact with, those particular projects and the people, everything will be coming in the scope. Okay, and for this entire thing on a company level, you need to first have a risk management policy, and in that risk management policy, okay, you need to define the risk management policy so that people in the company, they know what to do if we identify some kind of risk. Leadership team is also accountable to define the risk appetite. Now guys, what is this risk appetite? So the risk appetite is the level of risk which the company or the management is willing to take. Until certain level, the particular leadership team is ready to take this particular risk, and any risk which is falling within this acceptance level, right? That means you can go for risk acceptance. Anything which is going outside has to be treated. Sometimes what happens is the risk is not within your risk acceptance level, but it is deviating just a little bit, and because there are higher gains by taking that extra risk, you sometimes are little flexible in that. So this entire limit, this yellow line, right, is something called as risk tolerance. But at no cost, your risk should ever be creating your risk capacity. Now what is risk capacity? Risk capacity is the overall amount of risk a company can take. Beyond this, the company may go out of business. Okay, so there are few terms which you need to do. Actually, practically speaking, coming from the same background, I have been leading this entire effort for many companies. Actually, leadership team should also establish a risk statement. A risk statement is very much required so that all the people in the company, they get the right direction. Okay, how do we need to treat the risk? Because at the end of the day, a CTO or a CEO is not going to take those decisions every day. It is the people in the company, the managers in the company, who will be taking these kind of decisions, right? So all the people need to have that clarity. Okay, so that is what, these are some fundamental things which I wanted to tell you before I tell you about the risk management process. So now I am heading into making you understand the entire risk management process. Okay, so a risk management process actually starts with first the same thing, right? Risk identification, right? And I told you how the risk identification is done. You are going to reach out to the people, you are going to reach out to the stakeholder, and you are going to ask them certain questions, you are going to interview them, you are going to send them some kind of survey, and then they actually give you the outcome. When we send some kind of survey, it's quite interesting, right? When we send some kind of surveys, there is one kind of survey which is called as Delphi method. So Delphi method is very important because this is an anonymous survey. Don't just go on the name. It is nothing but an anonymous survey so that people can give their opinion freely. So you never disclose those people's name and other thing, in the entire risk assessment. So that's where you are going to do the risk identification. Parallelly, let's also talk about, let's say, how do you identify the risk? Let's create an Excel sheet here as a sample Excel sheet, and we will try to understand what all things you need to do. So let's say you have certain assets, then the asset value, and then you say, okay, what are the threats we have? And for making these threats, you might also like to make certain risk scenarios. So in a mature risk assessment team, sometimes we have some risk assessment scenarios already created. So based on those risk assessment scenarios, you are going to ask more effective questions when you are doing the risk assessment. So threats are there and threat scenarios are there, and based on that you also go to particular asset and try to find out what vulnerabilities exist on that, right? And once you identify those vulnerabilities, what is the impact if the particular threat realize a particular vulnerability and the risk actually occurs, then what is the impact? And then you also try to calculate likelihood. Until this part, until the likelihood, the entire process is called as risk identification, because this is where you are trying to identify the risk in the environment. Let's take some examples, right? Let's pick up one example. Let's say a laptop is there. Okay, what is the risk to a laptop? So when you reach out to them, you say, okay, laptop is critical for us because this particular laptop might have some project data and all of it. That is why it is critical. Don't just think about the cost of the laptop. The more important is the data which is kept on the laptop. So sometimes the laptop may be costing 50,000 rupees, but if the laptop is stolen, the data is maybe in lakhs, right? So that's kind of thing. Then what kind of threat may happen? So one of the threat you identify is theft of the laptop. Okay. The second thing you might have, that the laptop may be impacted by a malware. Okay, and I think, for example, I think these two are enough. Let's take it further. So you try to identify, okay, what is the vulnerability? Okay, what is the vulnerability in this particular threat? So you find that the laptops are getting stolen, but the problem here is the laptop do not have encryption, lack of encryption. And because there is lack of encryption, if somebody steal your laptop, they can put out your hard drive, they can connect it to a different device and can copy all your data. So that's a loss, right? Obviously that's a loss. And once that happens, what is the impact? So you can say, okay, laptop cost is equal to 50k, but the data which is on top of it is equal to 2 lakhs. So overall loss becomes 2.5 lakhs for one single laptop, right? Now you might also be interested to know, okay, how many laptops are stolen in the entire year, and that might be surprising for you. You might see that in a particular year there are 20 laptops which are kind of stolen, and because of that the likelihood is very, very high, right? Let's say there are 20 laptops which are stolen. So your likelihood becomes 20. On an average, the likelihood is 20, right? So this is how we calculate. Now this, whatever I have done to you, whichever I have told to you, is a little quantitative way. Let's do the other thing in a little bit of different way, which is called as qualitative way as well. So let's say the same laptop is impacted by malware. What is a vulnerability? You are using a antivirus software, you are not using a anti-malware solution. There is a difference between a antivirus or a anti-malware solution. Or let's say, even though you have anti-malware, you do not have EDR solution, let's say. That's a vulnerability. So this, if there is more vulnerability, then this is more likely that the threat may occur. When you try to calculate the impact, and let's say you don't have any values to show the impact, then how you can evaluate? So in that case, in the qualitative way of doing the things, how you can do is, let's say impact can be, let's say we give it a rating of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where 5 become catastrophic, means entire business may go down, right? It is so catastrophic, it is so this thing. Then 4 can be a major risk, third can be a risk, high risk you can say, then you can say low risk, and number 1 is negligible risk. So this is the kind of impact. You made your own scale based on these different parameters, and then you can say, okay, let's do one thing by, because this can be, let's say 4, the risk is 4. Same way, when it comes to likelihood, you might also need to have a scale for the same, and you may say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where 5 becomes certain, it is just about to happen. 4 becomes very likely, 3 becomes, let's say, possible, right? Number 2 becomes, you can give it a rating, right? You can say less possible, and 1 you can say rare, isn't it? And based on that, you give it a rating, let's say 5. It is about to happen, because you might not have good anti-malware solutions, and they are poorly managed and all of it. So you understood, right, guys, how we did this entire risk identification? This entire thing will happen when you reach out to the people, ask them certain questions, ask them about, interview them, try to examine the system and all of it. So all these kind of things will give you this particular input. So that's your risk identification part. Once the risk identification is done, the next activity is risk analysis. So in this risk analysis, now you have certain data with you, and based on that you are doing some kind of calculation on that. So you are going to, you are going to now evaluate it further. So let's say risk analysis in this particular way, let's say in this case, how much do you feel is the risk? Risk is equal to impact into likelihood. So here it is 2.5 lakhs into 20. So how much this becomes? 50 lakhs. So on an annual basis, you are losing 50 lakhs. And then here in this particular case, it is 20. And let's say some other risk also on 16, 12, something like that. Why we are doing all this activity? We are doing it because when there are so many risks, we need to give them some numbers so that it is easy for you to sort them, to identify which one is higher than the other. So that's the next activity which we do in the risk analysis. Once we do the risk analysis, the next thing is the risk reporting part, which is also actually coming in this only reporting. We are going to report the risk. And when you report the risk, there are two ways, or mostly I would say, let me talk about one way only, otherwise you will get confused. Let's say you say likelihood and this is your impact. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you create a table out of it. Okay, you create a kind of table just like this. Okay, and then you divide it like this. So based on this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's say 20. So 5 into 4. So your 20 will come here, isn't it? Your 20 will come here. Let's say 5 into 3, your 15 may come here. And let's say your risk acceptance level is here. This is your risk acceptance level. So any risk which is within your risk acceptance level, you are calculating it, but then you are taking a wise decision not to treat it because it is still within your acceptance level. But any risk which is going away from this line, that means that requires some kind of risk response, isn't it? So when we take the risk response, which is your next part, okay, let's talk about risk response. Okay, when we do the risk response, there are 4 possible ways in which you can respond to the risk. Let's say same chart, and one side we have high impact and likelihood. Okay, let's say there is some kind of risk, right? We can divide it like this, right? So if the risk, if the impact is low and the likelihood is also low, then what you feel should be the acceptable method? You are going to accept the risk, because both the things are low. You don't worry too much about it, right? So you can accept it. But when the impact is equal to low, right, but the likelihood is very high, so what do you feel you should do with it? You should treat the risk, right? You should remediate the risk. Okay, when the impact is equal to high and the likelihood is equal to low, impact is very high and likelihood is very low, so what you will do in that particular case? Normally we go with something called as risk transfer. Okay, and in case the risk is the impact is very high and the likelihood also very high, it is always advisable to avoid such kind of situation. Okay, let me just summarize this a little bit more for you by giving some example. Let's say in a particular case, your laptop is getting stolen, and the impact of laptop getting stolen, because everything is online, you don't keep anything, or you already have a encryption software implemented, and already just 1 or 2 laptop getting stolen in a year, so you might feel okay, it's still okay with me, I'm not gonna take some kind of decision on that. That's fine, I have measured my risk, but I'm still okay with that. The second thing is, when the impact is low, right, but likelihood is very high, now you see more and more laptop getting stolen and you are worried about it. This is always better that you implement some kind of controls. You either make a policy change, or you can have locks implemented, you can make sure encryption software is implemented and all of it, right? So that way you can lower the risk. Okay, then when it comes to impact is very high and likelihood is low, that means if something happens, then the risk is very high beyond your this thing, but it is very rare to happen. So it is always better to take an insurance, or maybe transfer to a third party and those kind of stuff. So that way we, at least if not transfer, we share the risk with somebody. And if you feel both the impact is also very high and likelihood is also very high, the laptop has very sensitive data, it is getting stolen, and there are so many laptops getting stolen, then it is better that you better come on desktops. Let the people come and work on the desktop inside your company, right? So these are different ways in which you can actually go and take some kind of decision. It's just for example, I'm not saying exactly this is what happens, but this is on those lines, the things will always happen. So this is called as a risk mitigation method, or this is also called as risk treatment. Okay, now when we treat the risk, let's say in this particular case you decided to treat the risk. So always when we want to treat the risk, it is always based on risk, right? And risk is more where the asset value is very high. That is where the risk is always very high, and based on that you are going to then implement the controls. When you implement these kind of controls, right, that is where you have to put some kind of thought process, because you are a risk analyst and you don't have to only bring the problem to the leadership, you might also have to bring up some suggestions and recommendation also to the leadership. And for that purpose, the controls which you are going to suggest should be based on certain logic, right? But before we go there, let's understand what is a control. So a control is something which can control something from happening, as simple as that. So a control can further be divided into two terms. One is called as safeguard and the another one is called as countermeasure. When a control is implemented proactively, it is called as safeguard, proactive, or you can say it is preventive, then it is called as safeguard. When a particular control is reactive or it is put in to lower the impact, then it is called as a countermeasure. Okay, whenever we select a particular control, you have to keep few things always in mind. For example, number one thing which you are going to keep in mind is the cost benefit analysis. Now, what is this cost benefit analysis? Cost benefit analysis is that let's say the inherent risk, that means the risk before implementing the control, minus the risk which remains after implementing the control, that means residual risk. When this particular risk, okay, is more than, when this is more than the cost of control, then it's a good decision, right? How it is a good decision? Because when we minus the inherent risk, residual risk from inherent risk, this gives us a picture of the risk remediated. The risk remediated. When the cost of remediated risk is more than the cost of control, it's always a good decision, right? Let's say because of implementing a firewall, you have actually you have remediated a risk of, let's say, $20,000, and for implementing the firewall, you have spent, like, let's say, $1,000. Don't you think it's a good decision to make? Because you have spent less, but your output is very high, the ROI is high, so that means it's a good decision. At the same time, if I say for remediating this $20,000 risk, if you have put up a firewall, you have spent on a firewall, let's say $30,000, will it be a good decision? Maybe from your, as a security guy, might be a good decision, but from a business perspective, it will be very difficult for you to explain to the business. That is why, being a security guy, you have to be very good communicator of security. You have to sell security to them, right? That's also a very important concept. So that's the thing, guys. Okay, so number one factor is cost benefit analysis. Second thing, the second important thing is psychological acceptability of the control. Logical acceptability of the control. Now, for this, I have a very funny example to give you, right? Let's say you want to implement a very strong, let's say, access control, and somebody told you the best access control is always DNA. There is no chance that it may it may be disidentified, or you will identify wrong. So DNA is what you have decided, but is it psychologically accepted by the people? ऑफिस में अपना कोई खून चुसवाने आएगा? Nobody will ever come to the office, right? So that's the thing. Another example, let me give you. You just recently became a CISO and you are very much worried about your passwords and all, and you created a password of 20 characters with all alphanumeric everything. You change your password policy, but is it psychologically accepted by the people? May not be. People every now and then they will forget their password, they will start writing their password and all of it. So this particular control may not work, right? So while selecting a particular control, you have to be mindful of these kind of stuff, which is very, very important. Now, a control can also be divided into three categories. It can either be a administrative control. What is administrative control? A control which is implemented by putting some kind of procedures, some kind of policy, some kind of things, right? That kind of thing, documentary kind of management controls. It can also be a physical control, right? Something as a physical control, dogs, guards, CCTV, all those kind of stuff, right? It can also be a technical control. And technical control is also called as a logical control as well. Okay, so this is where encryption, antivirus software, access control, all of that thing will come under this picture. Controls based on their nature can also be categorized under different categories, and there is no particular category, it's just to understand those kind of controls. So a control can be deterrent, right? For example, people keep saying, right, there is no dog in my house, but I still have a big board outside my door or outside my gate written, beware of dog. So any stranger will think twice getting into my home, right? That's a deterrent control. Then the control can also be preventive control. A control which is preventing something from happening. It is lowering the likelihood of something happening. That's a preventive control. Okay. A control can also be detective control, where it is able to detect something wrong happening. For example, your antivirus software catching a virus, your SIM solution identifying a deviation, and so on, right? So that's a detective control. A particular control can also be a corrective control. Your antivirus software identifies a malicious file and then clean it or quarantine it. That's a corrective control, right? Then a particular control can also be recovery control. If something goes bad, it is able to recover you back, like your backup, your disaster recovery plan, your business continuity plan, isn't it? All of those kind of controls, isn't it? And if unfortunately these right controls you are not able to implement somehow, and let's say you want to implement patching on a particular system, but that particular system is legacy, or there is a legacy application on top of that particular server, you will not be able to implement patching, right? Because the moment you implement patching, your application which is so valuable to you get down. So you will not be able to implement that particular control because there is a technical limitation, there might be a business limitation, there may be cost limitation, and so many things sometimes. Practically it happens. So in that way, what we do sometimes, we implement some additional controls, in lieu controls, uske badle mein kuch laga dete hain, right? Those kind of controls are called as compensatory controls. Okay, these compensatory controls are temporary in nature. Please understand, this is very important. In many companies, people always are behind compensatory controls. लगाते रहो, चलाते रहो, ऐसा होता है, लेकिन ऐसा ठीक नहीं है. It's not good for security. So a particular compensatory control should be a very time limited and temporary measure, and you should approve it only for a certain period of time, and then you should replace it with the original control. नहीं तो टूटी हुई साइकिल में वो लगा के आप चलाते ही रहोगे, right? वो at some point of time it will cost you more. So that's about these kind of controls. Controls always should have something called as control objective. Control objective is something which is what you want to achieve by implementing this particular control. Okay, what do you want to achieve? For example, you are going to implement a firewall and you want to lower 90% of the DDoS attack, or you want to implement you want to filter out 90% of malicious traffic which is coming to you, and this will actually lower your entire incident incoming incident, let's say by 20%. That's a control objective. It's in a quantitative way. So we must define these kind of quantitative way, and then based on that, on a regular basis, you should do your control evaluation, control testing, by vulnerability assessment, this and that, and all these kind of metrics, which will help you to identify control effectiveness, right? How much your controls are effective. That's kind of very, very important. So that's a very important topic to understand. And lastly, it is also very important to have a continual improvement on controls as well. See, control is not something you brought in from the market and just fit in and everything will go fine. Everything has a learning curve. For example, you have implemented a DLP in your company. The DLP might take its own sweet time for people getting educated, that learning management system, bringing that, understanding different kind of incident happening. Over a period of time, you will get a lot of learning. So everything has a maturity curve, isn't it? So this curve will only come when you are able to identify any gaps in the existing process. So we always implemented continual improvement, which actually works on PDCA cycle. What is PDCA? Plan, do, check, and act. Isn't it? So that's kind of very, very important. It is very critical for you to do entire this thing. I think I have covered risk management end to end for you, but just a small thing. I think we lost out only on one topic. That means quantitative and qualitative risk assessment. Quantitative and qualitative. Even though I am actually was thinking not to cover it because it is now less tested in the exam, but qualitative, you all know. Qualitative means we are trying to make a heat map and then show the controls, where the risk lies and all of it. So it is more of qualitative. But when it comes to quantitative, there are few concepts you need to understand. So we know risk is equal to impact into likelihood. Agree? That's what it is. So in a quantitative way, what happens is this impact is calculated by identifying SLE. Now what is SLE? Single loss expectancy. It is the loss which happens because of a single time occurrence of the risk. That's called as single loss expectancy. And there is a very simple formula for it, which is asset value into exposure factor, which is always in percentage. This asset value might be the cost of your asset. It might be because of something wrong happens, your business is down for 2 days and this much is the loss. So that is how you may see this kind of questions in the exam, right? So asset value into exposure factor. Exposure factor means how much your asset is actually exposed to the risk. 10%, 20%. For example, if something happens, then let's say if fire happens, 20% of my facility might be burnt already. So that's your exposure factor. Once you get your SLE, it is very important to multiply it with likelihood. And for likelihood, we have another term which is called as annual rate of occurrence. So what happens is, over a period of time, you have to evaluate the trend for something. Let's say your laptop's getting stolen, or your company getting breached, or your people not following some kind of process and which is leading to a security problem. So, or let's say flood. how many floods are coming to your this thing. So you are going to learn history of, let's say, 100 years, how frequently on an average things happens with you, and then you see on a annual basis what is that risk, SLE into annual rate of occurrence. If something happens 5 times in 1 year, so your ARO will be 5. If something happens once in 5 years, then your ARO will become 1 by 5. Simple as that. And this will give you a term which is called as annual loss expectancy. We are calculating annually because when it comes to quantitative term, we always calculate on an annual basis. So it is SLE, the loss which happens. I told you, right, your laptop, one single laptop getting stolen cost you, let's say, 1.5 lakhs. And then how many laptop getting stolen on an average? Let's say 20. So you multiply these two terms to calculate your ALE. So nowadays I don't see this is getting tested, but yeah, you should know it from your CISA exam, CISM exam, CISSP exam, all of it. So that's your risk management end to end. I hope you enjoyed, right?